everyone. Thank you for joining us today as Keith gives us a perspective on cover crop mixes. My name is Shannon Muller, and I am a soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute. My colleagues, Odine Alvarez with the Soil Health Institute and Olivia Cayuet with the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture, are also on the call, providing technical support. We three support the education component of Farmers for Soil Health. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide you all with insight into cover crop mixes and species diversity and give you some insights on how this practice can be utilized to enhance farm resilience. Today's webinar is supported by Farmers for Soil Health, or FSH. This initiative is one of many USDA-funded Advancing Markets for Producers projects. FSH is a collaborative initiative of commodity organizations, the United Soybean Board, the National Corn Growers Association, and the National Pork Board, with a goal to increase cover crop adoption. This specific project provides an incentive to farmers who are new to planting cover crops or who have been planting cover crops for many years. State-level commodity organizations and conservation professionals work across 20 states, stretching from North Dakota to the East Coast to provide local technical assistance and outreach programming. FSH has also developed a website full of resources and information. You can learn more about FSH at farmersforsoilhealth.com. Lastly, a few items about today's event. This presentation is being recorded, and an email will be sent with the link to the webinar recording posted to the CRA YouTube channel, along with the final feedback survey. We'll end with a Q&A moderated by Odine and Keith. So, as questions come up, please put them in the Q&A. You can upvote questions that you'd like to prioritize as we cover them live. If you run into any technical issues, please don't hesitate to chat the webinar co-hosts, and we will work to resolve any issues. If you'd like captions on, those can be enabled by clicking the three dots on your toolbar and navigating to captions. Be sure to hang on till the end for information related to One Certified Crop Advisor Soil and Water Continuing Education Unit for attending this webinar. With that being said, I'm excited to introduce our guest, Keith Burns. I'll let Keith introduce himself and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate that. Let me make sure we can advance here. Okay. Yeah. So my name is Keith Burns. My brother Brian and I own and operate Green Cover Seed out of the south central part of Nebraska. We also farm there. We grew up on the farm. We're still farming the same ground that we grew up on. And in 2008, we started Green Cover. The picture you see in the lower left-hand corner there, that's what Green Cover Nebraska looks like right now. But in 2011, that was all farm ground. We started building there and just kept building buildings and grain bins in response to the cover crop industry growing and us growing right along with it. So I have the pleasure of being able to get to do a lot of teaching, a lot of talking with folks, and so honored to be here to do that. So I thought I'd start out today. We're definitely going to get into why diversity is so important. We're extremely passionate about that. And as I get into this more, I'll actually even talk about one of the experiments that we did early on that helped us get Green Cover started. But I want to just lay the groundwork and the foundation for why we feel like cover crops are so important and why they're such a critical part of any rotation, whether you're corn, soybeans, or whether you're an orchard or a vineyard or vegetables. We feel like it's an important part of any rotation. And I want to just talk a little bit about why. And so you should never do a cover crop unless you know why. What are the goals for the cover crop that you're going to do? Because if you're just going to do it because you read about it in a magazine and it sounds like a cool idea, you're probably not going to have the success that you're hoping for, because you really have to target in on what your goal is. And so we like to take people through this thought process of why are you doing a cover crop? What are you trying to accomplish? And there's lots of things you can accomplish. Boosting your soil biology is probably one of the most important. But to be honest, when we started Green Cover back in 2009, this wasn't even on our radar. Most of the biology you can't even see. It's so microscopic, like the mycorrhiza fungi right in the center of the screen there. Can't even see that. And so we didn't really realize how important that was. We could see worms, and as we were no-tilling and integrating cover crops, we saw more worms. But we've really come to understand that the biology is such a critical part of it, and it's hard to have good, healthy, biologically active soils without having living roots in the soil at all times, which requires cover crops. Erosion prevention was a super easy one to start with because cover crops can almost eliminate erosion. When you have that ground covered, when you have a living root in the soil, when you have the armor on the soil, we can almost eliminate erosion. Weed control was another huge impact. You see in the foreground where I had a skip with my cereal rye. I had mare's tail coming up in my corn, and in the background that there's that same corn is growing in that cereal rye that's just been terminated back there. Zero mare's tail. And so we can really have some beneficial weed control aspects of doing smart cover crops. Again, here you see with the soybeans on the left-hand side where the cereal rye was, very few weeds. On the right-hand side where there wasn't any cover crop rye, lots of weeds coming in. So weed control is a big one. Nitrogen fixation. So this is a picture from one of my organic customers. He grew hairy vetch. He grew 200 pounds of nitrogen. He's rolling it down. He's planting organic corn right into that. And he grew 200 bushel organic corn with no fertilizers, no herbicides, because he grew enough nitrogen to grow that big corn crop. And so just a few tests here. This is clippings that we sent in. This is 30 pounds of cereal rye and 15 pounds of vetch. And it was planted October 1st. We tested this June 1st, which I know is a little late, but this is a particularly cool spring. 134 pounds of nitrogen in this rye vetch combination. When we went to just straight vetch in that same time frame, look at that, over 200 pounds of nitrogen is what was found in just straight vetch. So you can fix a lot of nitrogen if that's what your goal is. And if that's what your goal is, we can help you do that, but you have to do some other things different in your operation. You can't be planting corn the end of April if you want to achieve this. So again, what are the goals for what your cover crop is going to be? Maybe you want to just cycle and make more available the nutrients that are already in your soil. Certainly cover crops do a good job of that. And it's not really the cover crops so much as the biology that the cover crops are supporting that's making that happen. And so we can take the nutrients from one crop residue and cycle them, make them available for another. We can release some of the nutrients that are in your soil and make them available for the next crop. So that's a very good goal. Beneficial and pollinator insect habitat and forage. Maybe you have insect problems and you want to try to attract the beneficials. A great goal and very important, especially for orchards, vineyards, vegetables, any type of specialty crop. But it's still important even for the corn soybean guy because we can attract a lot of these beneficials, which really will help control the harmful insects. Compaction and infiltration issues. We all have compaction, some more than others, but cover crops can certainly help address that. The living root of a cover crop can help break through those compaction layers, can help us infiltrate more water into our soils. Very important. And then supplemental forage. If you have livestock or if you have neighbors or people in the area that have livestock, this is the most immediate payback of a cover crop that you can get. Because, cattle prices are really good right now. You can grow lots and lots of really high quality forage. Cattle do extraordinarily well on this. It's an easy payback on those cover crops. And so those are some of the goals. And again, if you're thinking about doing cover crops, you need to kind of think through why. What do you want to try to accomplish? And then when you start putting your cover crop mix together, now you can be targeting around two or three of these goals. You can't just say I want to do them all. We would all like to do them all, but in order to really get the best mix to address your issue, you're going to have to kind of hone in on one, two, or three of these. And so, as we talk about cover crops, one of the big questions is when. The when question, how you answer that is going to some extent, determine what you can plant. When it comes to fall planting, in a corn soybean rotation, timing is so critical to that. Because especially some of you in the more northern regions, you just don't have much growing season left. And so You have to be looking at, can you plant it before you harvest? How are you going to terminate it next spring? Can you find really cold hardy varieties that will survive? So timing is really critical. And when you don't adjust the rest of your system to help the cover crops fit in properly, they're just not going to work very well. And we see that a lot in the corn soybean rotation. When people don't address this timing issue, it can be a real issue for having success with the cover crops. And then finally, again, before we jump in here to the diversity part, how are you going to plant them? Are you going to drill them? Are you going to broadcast them? If you're going to broadcast them, how are you going to get good seed to soil contact? And that real big question there, again, it kind of goes back to the when. How can you take advantage of every fall day possible if your growing season is limited? So that might mean planting on some of your acres a little shorter maturity corn or a shorter relative maturity on your soybeans, or looking at selling some wet corn to a feedlot close to you. Just anything that you can do to get something harvested sooner is going to help you get started with your cover crop planting. And so some of the ways that you've done it, we can be chasing the combine with the air seeder. So again, we are not missing any days there. This is a picture from our farm. We don't do this all the time, but when we can and we have enough labor, we like to have the seeder chasing the combine because again, we don't want to miss any days. Some guys are really creative. This is sent in by customers of ours. They've got a seeder right on the corn head. You can't get much closer to after harvest than this. They're blowing that seed down onto the ground right behind the corn head and then letting all the chaff from the combine cover over the top of it. You can do it before you harvest. You can use a high boy, something like this. You can use drones. You can use airplanes to get that cover crop seeded actually before harvest, as long as you have some sunlight coming in there. And then just other ways that you can be getting the seed to the ground prior to harvest. So just you got to be thinking through all those things. But kind of our topic for today is diversity, and we are such big fans of diversity, and I'm going to tell you why here in a little bit. But if soil health is your goal, and if you're thinking about doing cover crops, or if you're in the Farmers for Soil Health program, I'm assuming that soil health is one of your goals, and so it is difficult to overstate how important crop diversity is going to be in accomplishing that goal. Because plants were created to grow in diverse ecosystems. If you look in nature, you are never going to see a monoculture in a natural system. They're designed, they do best, they thrive in these diverse ecosystems. When you have diversity, you have a lot of resilience. You're resilient to diseases, resilient to insects, you're resilient to drought. Diversity brings resilience. And we want a balanced diet for our soil biology because even good things like legumes and like brassicas, if they're not in balance, they can be harmful. They're really good when they're in balance. They can be harmful to the biology. They can be harmful to your soil structure when they're out of balance. And so we want to try to bring all things into balance. And it's really difficult to balance a cover crop mix if you've only got one thing in there. And so again, that's why crop diversity we feel like is really, really important. So I want to take you through just some of the ways that we think about diversity. I want to make the case for why diversity is so very, very important. So the first thing I want to just talk a little bit about is what's called the Jena experiment. This is from a research farm in Germany, and this is probably the longest ongoing research on diverse biosystems in the world. They've been doing research. You can see all the little plots there. That they've been doing this research for, I don't know, 40 or 50 years. It's a long time. And so they've got really good data, long-term data, and they're comparing single species crops versus multi-species of all kinds. And I'll show you that. You can look this up. There's a video. I'm not going to play the video. I just want to show you that if you want to learn more about this, you can go do that. Certainly good stuff there. But in this, what they have found, you can see how they charted that out there. As the number of species gets bigger, and they go from 1 to 16 on this chart, the biomass, the overall biomass of what is produced goes up. And it goes up fairly significantly. And so they're showing, with one species, they're getting, they're measuring grams per square meter there, I guess. But really what they see is a steady increase as you add diversity. Doesn't necessarily mean you're adding more overall seed, you're adding more diversity. May not be more pounds necessarily, but certainly the diversity helps your biomass go up. And as your biomass increases, we generally see all the other benefits, whether it be erosion prevention, nitrogen fixation, weed suppression, all of those goals that I shared in the beginning, those are all going to go up in general as your biomass goes up as well. So we want to produce as much as possible because when our above ground biomass is increasing, the below ground benefits, our roots, our root exudates, they are increasing in proportion to the biomass. And so that's what we want to see. We want to grow as much as possible. We see more of that when we're doing diverse mixes. So the graphic that they have here when they're doing one all the way up to, I think they did all the way up to 64 different species, but they just see that biomass increase. It kind of tails off or levels off after about 16, but they do see good results there. Plant diversity has a positive effect on the diversity of other organisms in the ecosystem. Jonathan Lundgren and Ecdysis Foundation with their Thousand Farms Initiative has really good data on this. When they go into regenerative farms that have really good diversity, they see the diversity of insects just explode. And I know I've heard him say that, for every pest type insect, there's 16 or 1700 other insects that are either beneficial or they're neutral. And so when we create an environment that promotes diversity, the insect diversity is going to be a benefit to that system. Diverse plant communities release diverse organic compounds, which results in more carbon sequestration, more microbial activity, and more nutrient availability. I talked earlier when we talked about all those benefits. If you want to cycle nutrients, cover crops are important to do that, but it's not necessarily the cover crop itself that's doing that. It's the microbiome, it's all of the bacteria and the fungal populations that the cover crops are supporting. That's what is going to make those nutrients available for your next crop. And the more diverse our cover crop mix is, the more diverse our microbiome is, the more nutrients that are going to get cycled and released for that next crop. So if you want to reduce the inputs that you're paying for, adding a diverse cover crop mix with the appropriate biological community can really help reduce your need for external inputs. Diversity leads to better resilience against both drought and flooding. They saw that they actually had a big flood on this research farm, and they definitely saw more resilience to coming back after the flood where they had diversity to where they didn't. And then again, just looking at nature, these diverse ecosystems they're more productive, they're more stable than simplified systems. And unfortunately, with the way that we farm, it's hard to get that diversity in there. And so I'm going to talk about that in a little bit here. So just a few more pictures closer to home here. So some of you may have seen these. These are pretty famous pictures. Gabe Brown, Jay Fuhrer, they took this concept back to North Dakota in 2006, and they did some experiments, and they planted cover crops in individual strips, and then they planted a mixture of all the cover crops. And they had an extremely dry year, less than 1 inch of rain from one time they planted it, less than 3 inches for the year. This is what their turnips looked like. This is what their radishes looked like, about like what you'd expect. They kind of just burned up. But where they had everything mixed together, look at that. Look at the amount of growth that they got there. Now, that's not, the most beautiful, luscious cover crop you've ever seen. But for less than 3 inches of rain for the first 7 months of the year, that's pretty darn good. And it was right next to those plots that were all burned up. So the diversity is making it resilient to that drought. So we actually saw these pictures. We talked to Gabe, we talked to Jay, and they told us what they did. And we were like, well, that's really interesting, but how would it work in Nebraska? And before we started Green Cover, we were very nervous about the water use. And so in 2008, we wrote a little SARE grant. We got about $5,000. We bought moisture sensors and data loggers. We planted 18 different cover crop plots in monoculture strips, and then we planted several combinations of the mixes. And basically what we did is we had these moisture sensors at 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot levels. And what we saw pretty consistently is anything that was planted by itself. So all 18 of those monoculture strips, when anything was planted by itself, it used quite a bit of moisture. Now we had good moisture that summer, so everything looked good. But these charts, and the further down on the chart that you go, the more moisture that cover crop is used. This is what the soybean chart looked like. The different colors are different depths. This is what common veg looked like. And again, the crop looked good, but what this chart tells us is that at the end of the season, it had used most of the moisture in my profile. So it's not going to be leaving me a lot of moisture for next year. That would be very concerning to us. But here's what really got us excited. And to be honest, this is why we started Green Cover when we saw this. Here's mix number one. And this is a mix of about 10 or 12 different things. You can see what was in it there. It used water so much more efficiently. And when we started seeing this, we thought, well, something is wrong with that. I mean, that almost looks like the sensors weren't working or nothing's going on there. Mix two had a little more variability, but really by the end of the season, that the moisture profile, it had really recovered it. And we still don't understand exactly how that's happening, but the moisture sensors are showing on this chart the exact same thing that Gabe and Jay were showing in the field with those burn up turnips and burn up radishes, and then this really thriving ecosystem of diverse mixes. So basically, what we learned is that cover crop mixes are much more efficient at water usage than monocultures. And again, frankly, this is why we started Green Cover, because we were convinced that if we could put things into the right diverse mixes, the moisture situation, it's still always going to be a concern in arid areas, but it was something that we could work with, we could work around, we could work with the system instead of it working against us. We also saw how well the cattle did grazing those diverse mixes, and so that's really why we launched Green Cover, is because we saw how powerful these diverse mixes were from the very beginning. And so, again, as we look at our systems, and many people, corn, soybeans, wheat, it's going to be difficult. And we have customers that are doing this. They may grow 8, 9, 10 different cash crops. That's hard. That's really hard to do. And most people aren't going to do that. However, it's relatively easy to add diversity into your system through these cover crop mixes. Because here's the deal, folks. Cover crops allow you to introduce all this diversity without needing specialized equipment, specialized knowledge, or specialized markets. And if you're going to try to increase your diversity with your cash crops, you're going to need one of those three things, maybe all three of those things. You may need different equipment. Certainly will need different knowledge if you're going to grow a new crop you've never grown before. And then you got to sell it somewhere. You can't just take it down to the elevator and dump it off. You have to build the market for some of these specialty things. And for those that are willing to do that, there's great opportunities out there. But for many people, uh, it's just so much easier to add the diversity through the cover crop mix, because I can plant it with just the equipment that I have. I don't really need to have a lot of knowledge because I'm not taking it all the way out to maturity and to grain harvest. And I don't have to market it because my market is the soil biology. They're going to eat that. They're going to consume that. That's going to be their house. It's going to be their food. And so the market is built into your soil, and it wants to buy what you want to grow. And so it's really a great setup and a great fit there. And so just a couple caveats on diversity, and this is going to affect most of you, and it should affect how you think about how are you going to get diversity into that system. So the more specific your goals are, the less diverse your mixes will typically be. So in this instance I showed you earlier, our organic customer here, his number one goal was to produce 200 pounds of nitrogen so he could grow 200 bushel organic corn. And so his mix was not very diverse. It was hairy vetch and lots of it. And it was not a cheap mix, but it was way cheaper than my bill for putting 200 pounds of nitrogen on my irrigated corn. And so he had a very narrow focus of what his goals were. So he didn't need a lot of diversity because this was achieving the goals that he had. Now, if his goals were a little more broad and wide ranging, we would have had more diversity in there. But again, that was the goal that he chose. And then number two, and this affects most of us, the tighter your planting windows, the fewer species will work, and thus the less diverse your mixes will be. And that's why I started out this talk talking about the when and the how, and really challenging you to be thinking through when can you get the cover crop planted? How are you going to get it planted? Because frankly, we're here in Nebraska, and if we're not planting until late October because that corn's coming off late, I don't have a lot of diversity options. Cereal rye is a good fit just about any time for just about anybody, so you can always plant that. But I'm limited on what kind of diversity I can add to that. Could I add hairy vetch? Yeah, probably a little bit. Rapeseed, camelina, some of these things can be added in, but the earlier that I can get, the better those are going to be. And if I start getting into November, I'm just going to plant cereal rye because it's better than doing nothing. It's way better than doing nothing. It's not as good as if I could do a more diverse mix, plant at the end of September. But you got to take what you got. You have to work within the context that you have. And so that's why I would encourage you to think about how can you plant some cover crops early. And there's going to just be some fields that are always going to be late, and that's okay. I would still plant something to get that ground covered, achieve some of those goals. Just know that you won't have the diversity that you could when you planted earlier. And so I'll just finish out here before we go to Q&A. We have a tool on our website. It's free for everybody to use. You can get on this. You can create your own free account. And this tool will help you build mixes. It's called Smart Mix. It's your field, it's your mix, Smart Mix. And so basically, the tool allows you to set up an account. You tell it where you're at. It knows all your climate and geographical weather data for your area. And basically, you go in, you have to tell it the goals that you want to achieve. I talked about how important that was earlier. So you have to tell it what you want to try to accomplish, and then you answer other questions about, are you going to drill it? Are you going to broadcast it? When are you going to seed it? When are you going to terminate it? You put all this information in, and then what the tool does, you see it knows the information here about you, and then the tool will go through and yeah, here's all the goals. So when you put all that in, it's going to give you, it's basically, it's not going to tell you exactly what you should plant, but it's going to tell you these species would be excellent for what you're trying to accomplish. These species are going to be pretty good. And then it's going to say there's some marginal things in there that probably wouldn't be the greatest choices. And then there's going to be ones, again, depending on the time frame you've chosen, that are just going to be risky, and it's just going to say, you really shouldn't do that because, we just have no confidence at all that that's going to work for you. And so this allows you to go through and choose the ones you want. There's tons of information built into here. These are just screenshots, so I can't really show this, but if you go and create your own account. So, for example, cowpeas are rated really highly, but maybe you don't know what a cowpea is or don't know what cowpeas do. There's this little play button right there. You can click on that. It will show a video. It will show a couple of the green cover team out in the field, out in a plot of cowpeas, and there's like a little 3-minute video that talks about cowpeas, when you would use them, the benefits of them, maybe the drawbacks, when you shouldn't use them. So most each one of these will have some sort of video attached to it that you can teach yourself, what's the difference between brown top millet and sorghum sudan. And so those videos will really kind of help take you through that. Once you build all that, you put all this in, the program kind of helps you balance the pounds per acre. There's all kinds of informational charts here. It will tell you how well you're scoring. So in this particular example, I chose supplemental grazing and long-lasting residue for my goals. It's telling me that my mix is 100%. It's a great mix for supplemental grazing. It's only 60% on my lasting residue because the choices that I made, it's not as long lasting residue as it could have been because of these choices. Down at the bottom, it has other things like how good is it for nitrogen fixation, grazing, drought tolerance, all these things. So there's lots of information there, way too much to explain, but I would encourage you to go and look if you want. Here's one really important fact is that as you build this in real time, it's going to tell you exactly what this would cost. If you buy it from us, we have lots of people that use this tool and never buy seed from us, and that's okay. It's a bit of a public service. It's there to help people. We want to encourage people to plant cover crops, whether they're buying the seed from us or not. But this will tell you what it would cost from us, and it gives you a ballpark idea because it doesn't do you any good to build a really great mix if it's going to be $50 and your budget was only $25. So it's going to tell you in real time what this seed is going to cost. And you can probably get it other places, and it will give you a baseline of, kind of a range of where it should be there. So it's a good tool for doing some what if scenarios. Oh, that's too much money. I'm going to go back and I'm going to make some adjustments. It doesn't seem like it's good enough for grazing. I'm going to go back and make some adjustments. And it just kind of helps you play some what if scenarios as you go through there. You can also add inoculants to it. It can give you some shipping quotes. So again, if you're interested in that, you can certainly go in. You can save the mixes that you worked on. You can bring them back up later. So all kinds of tools like that built in. So that's kind of my presentation. I wanted to just encourage you to check our website out for other free resources. We've got soil health resource guides. You can, if you see us at a show, we'll have these there for free. We generally print 20 to 30,000 of these each year. Each one of these is a different year. We give those all away for free to people. You can download PDFs of all the back copies on our website as well. My email is there, keith@greencover.com. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you that way. And then if the conversation gets into where we need a phone call, happy to do that as well. So I think at this point, Odine, we can. I'm gonna stop sharing if that's okay, and we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith, for sharing all this great information. I really appreciated how you set the stage for us to understand cover crops mixes by having us think about the goal and the timing and the how, and also just the explanation of how if soil health is your goal, then then crop diversity is like a key way of achieving that, and cover crop mixes can help. So thank you for all of that knowledge. And yeah, we truly appreciate your time and willingness to share this information with us. And now for everyone, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box is down in the lower banner. You can also use the raise hand feature if you'd like to come off mute and ask a question out loud. So we'll give a few minutes or maybe a few seconds for those questions to come in.
Looks like we have one in the chat from Matt. Can I go ahead and answer that one?
Yes, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so Matt's saying he's in Northwest Ohio. With pre-herbicides in mind, I've considered adding buckwheat to my soybean seed, let it grow until first post-herbicide pass. What are your thoughts? Well, it depends on your pre's, but we actually are. I used to never think that interseeding into soybeans was a very viable option, and the reason is the main reason is I was thinking that I needed to get the cover crop out to the end of the season. And if it's growing out there within your soybeans, it's well, first of all, it's going to struggle because of lack of sunlight. Secondly, it could become a harvest issue. But the last couple of years, we've started rethinking that, and we've started thinking, you know what? It doesn't need to be there. In fact, it shouldn't be there at the end of the season. But what kind of benefits can I bring at the beginning of the season to get that crop off to a good start, and then either spray it out, roller crimp it out, let the soybean canopy choke it out, and not have it be an issue. And so, again, working with a lot of, we learn so much from our customers. And so we've got some customers that have been doing some really innovative, pretty cool things with soybeans. And because we got inspired by them this past year, this past spring, we planted some soybeans in 30-inch rows. And then we went in and we interseeded a 5-way mix. We did buckwheat, like you're mentioning here, Matt. We did flax, we did oats, we did rye, and we did mustard. And the combination of those five, it was interesting because we didn't do a big section, but we could see all five of those out there. We felt like we got better weed control. Now, we did not have any type of pre-herbicide down. We didn't have any residuals out there to have to worry about, because depending on what residuals you have, it would definitely limit. You probably wouldn't be able to do all five of those things. But we started fairly clean. We burnt down, we planted the soybeans, and we came back and we planted the cover crop the same day. And we put 3 rows of cover crops in between the 30-inch rows of beans. And then we just let that grow. And we had pretty good weed control. The cool thing is that mustard grows so fast. Early on, that mustard was by far the tallest thing out there, and it started blooming. And we had these beautiful yellow blossoms out there, and it was bringing in lots of beneficial pollinator type insects prior to, the beans starting to bloom. And the beans, don't need pollinators, but most of the research shows they can benefit from it when you do have them out there. And so I guess that's a long answer to saying if your pre-emergence residual herbicides will allow buckwheat to grow, I for sure would try to get it out there. Now we sprayed it out with our posts, like what you're talking about, but we've had organic customers and they would plant mustard, and I think you could do buckwheat as well. And then they had a roller crimper that they could roll right down the row in between their 30-inch rows of beans, and they rolled that down before the beans canopied and took care of it that way. And one of the reasons he was doing just straight mustard is that soybean cyst nematode is a big issue in a lot of places. This particular customer is from Minnesota. He felt like he had some issues with soybean cyst nematode. Mustards are known to have good effects against nematodes. And so he was trying to see if he could get a positive benefit, weed control for sure, but then also against soybean cyst nematode as well. So I think if you can figure out your chemical schedule and that you can make it work, I wouldn't just do buckwheat. I would do, again, diversity. Like I say, we did two grasses, the rye and the oats. We did buckwheat, we did flax, and we did the mustard. That's a nice diverse mix, and we're definitely going to be trying more of it on larger scale in 2026.
That's great. Thank you for that explanation and sharing your thoughts. Keith, we have a lot of great questions coming through our Q&A. So the first one that I see here is, could you expand on the mechanics of moisture management, especially in dry conditions?
Well, I wish I was smart enough to give a better answer here. Uh, I think there's multiple things going on when we saw the pictures from North Dakota that those guys did. We saw the moisture charts that our sensors were showing us. Why is that happening? That's really one of the big questions. Um, and I've asked that question to experts like Christine Jones and Chris Nichols and Jill Clapperton. And again, I don't think anybody completely and fully understands all the mechanisms that go on there. One answer that I thought was really interesting was, and I don't remember which one of those ladies, suggested this as part of the hypothesis, was that, a plant, in order to get CO2, in order to get, it has to bring in the atmosphere. And so it has to open the stomata up to do that. And when the stomata is open, water escapes from the plant. And so the more that it has to open those stomata to allow atmosphere in, the more water it loses out those same openings. And so the theory was, in a really diverse environment, those plants are growing so healthy and there's some sharing of those carbon resources. There's carbon coming from underneath from decomposing residue and not just from the atmosphere above. And so the stomata tend to be open for shorter periods of time in a diverse mix than in a monoculture. And then you lose less moisture. The other thing, think about it like this. The most competitive environment that you can put a corn plant into is going to be into a field with other corn plants. And the most competitive environment for a soybean is with other soybean plants. And for a wheat plant, it's going to be with wheat plants, because everything in that field, all your neighbors are needing the exact same nutrients, the exact same water requirements. You have the same rooting depth, you have the same canopy height, everything is the same. It's incredibly competitive, and everybody is fighting for resources when everybody's the same and everybody needs the same thing at the same time. In a diverse environment, you have different root structures, you have different rooting depths, you have different nutrient needs, you have different water needs, and those needs are going to be spread out. And when you have good biology there to tie all of those systems together, like mycorrhizal colonization, there's good research that shows those plants will not only share nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus can move between plant to plant, they will also share water back and forth with each other. And when you have all that biology, a bacteria is made up primarily of water. And as those die, as they decompose, they're cycling that water through the system. So I think there's a lot of mechanics of how that's working. That's probably just a few of them. Again, the better infiltration, less evaporation, I think that all plays into part of it as well. In short, it's extremely complex, but nature proves that it works.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, how it works. The next question I have here is, does the Smart Mix calculator work in other states, such as Wisconsin?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, we have the weather data in there for all 60 some thousand zip codes in the in the continental US. I don't know that Alaska and Hawaii are in there. But yes, if you live in the continental US, your zip code should be in there, and it should be populated with your average rainfall, your growing degree days, your first frost, your last frost. That should all be in the database for your zip code. It's based on zip codes. And so, yes, you should be able to plug that in and go. It does not work for other countries. So if you're in another country, you have to kind of cheat and you have to find someplace in the US that has a similar climate and then put that in as your zip code.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sounds like a really useful tool. Yeah. And thank you for the tip to adapt it to other places too. The next question I have here is increased soil health breaking down herbicide residues faster?
Well, that's a great question, and certainly, herbicide residues are a big concern. Um, I I'm going to say yes, but if you say, well, show me the studies to prove that and all that, I'm sure they're out there. I guess I don't have them right off the tip of my tongue. But I do know this, that as you build carbon into your soil, as your organic matter levels go up, and the primary factor for building soil carbon, building organic matter, it's not what you grow above the ground, because the vast majority of that, 80 to 90% of that carbon is going to just cycle and return to the atmosphere. And that's fine. That's how the natural system works. It's very valuable in protecting your soil against erosion. It's very valuable for keeping your soil cooler. But it's not that valuable for putting carbon into the soil. That comes from the root exudates, the liquid carbon that's coming out through the roots, and it's feeding all of your biology. So the more roots and the more biology, the more you're going to put carbon into your soil that's going to be long lasting. High carbon soils will break down herbicide residues much faster than low carbon soils. Part of that is because that's the food source for your biology. And so when you say, will soil health break down herbicide residue faster? I think the subset of that is increased biological activity will break down herbicide residue faster. And that's only going to come when you have increased soil health. Now, as to how fast and what chemicals and these different things, either that's difficult. There's certainly going to be certain categories of biology that are going to work better than other. I was just at the Acres conference and Don Huber was there, and he talks a lot about glyphosate residues, and one of the things they found the most effective at breaking down glyphosate residue, and this is crazy for me to think about. It's sauerkraut juice. Sauerkraut. So they go to these sauerkraut factories and they get all of their waste product from making sauerkraut and they spray it on their fields, and they're seeing incredible effects at speeding up the decomposition of that glyphosate molecule. And it's not because of the sauerkraut juice, it's because of the bacteria. It's a fermented product, and so it's just rich with these certain types of bacteria, and what makes sauerkraut a good product is also helping in the soil. So that's just one example of how that could work.
That's really cool. Yeah. Good tip there. Our next one is to avoid allelopathy between crops, what mixtures do you not recommend? Yeah, to avoid that.
Yeah, so that is a good question, and certainly one that we discuss often. First, I think it's important that we understand what true allelopathy is. A true allelopathy, my current understanding of this is that it is a chemical inhibition of germination. So when you truly have an allelopathic effect, your corn is not going to germinate. So if your corn is turning yellow, that's not allelopathy because it germinated and it's growing, but it's not growing right. That's more of a nutrient tie-up. That's a different issue. But a lot of times people say, well, that cereal rye was allelopathic to the corn. Well, no, if it germinated and came up and started to grow, that's probably not quite the right term for it. And so it is pretty rare to see actual allelopathy from a cover crop to a major cash crop. Now, cereal rye is very allelopathic to small seeded weeds, mare's tail, uh, pigweed, water hemp early on. It's very, very good at suppressing the germination. That's true allelopathy. Typically on larger seeds like corn and soybeans and even the cereal grains, we don't see that. We don't see an inhibited germination. However, it is not uncommon to see a tie-up or a disruption of your nutrient cycling, and you will see yellow corn and you will see stunted other crops. That's not allelopathy, but it's certainly an issue, and it certainly is one that needs to be thought about and considered because cereal rye is such a great scavenger of nitrogen. Don't blame it if it's doing its job and it's tying that nitrogen up and making your corn yellow. You have to figure out how to manage around that. It's not a bug, it's a feature of cereal rye, and you got to figure out how to appropriately use that. It's great for soybeans. You don't want that early nitrogen for them, but for corn, it can be devastating if you don't have a good plan for supplying nitrogen needs to that corn early on. So we don't really see allelopathy between a cover crop and a cash crop. What we do see is the nutrient cycling issues.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Our next question says, I realize it is goal dependent, but are there things the urban farmer or small farmer growing in raised beds or small plots should think about when using cover crops?
Well, actually, you have some really good advantages when you're doing really small areas like a raised bed or a small plot because termination, you have a lot better termination options, I should say. And when you have better termination options, you can really plant whatever you want. I mean, because you can go out there and you can, do a foot crimper, or you can do a tarping type situation, or you can, just use hand shears and clip it down. So and we do work with a lot of gardeners, a lot of market gardeners, urban farmers. Diversity is such a key here. And again, it's easier to plant and terminate these small plots because if you have the seed, you can just scatter it out there. You can rake it in. You can water it up. You have a lot of options that you couldn't do if you're doing this on, hundreds of acres. And so, diversity is going to be really critical. Again, with small areas, I would err on the side of more diversity and not less. And in fact, we have some specific mixes we put together that gardeners can use, and they're just, combinations of 10 to 15 different things that are appropriate for a cool season planting, or appropriate for a warm season planting, or an overwintering mix. And so the biggest thing that you would want to watch out for there is if you were coming in with a brassica crop as your cash crop next, any of your leafy greens, lettuces, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, things like that. I would try to not have brassicas in my cover crop mix the year before because there could be some transference of insects and diseases and things like that. That's usually the main thing that we would worry about. But even with that being said, if you've got a really big diverse mix and those brassicas are a very small part of it, it's probably not that big a deal.
Great. Thank you for that response. And our last question over here, it says, what kind of mix do you recommend for a 45-day window for cover crops?
Well, it'd probably be the same as I'd recommend for a 60 or 80 day window of cover crops. Again, it's going to depend on number one, what is your goals? Number two, where are you located and when are you planting? And then how are you planning on terminating that? Because that is really going to determine, what species go in that. So if it's 45 days and then it's going to freeze, well, do you want everything to die then, or do you want some things to live after the frost but not overwinter? So this is where, we like to just meet one-on-one with people and get the answers to those questions of what are your goals, where are you located, when are you planting, and what is that next crop, and how are you going to terminate it? And so there's lots of things that grow really fast. Buckwheat grows extremely fast. I mentioned mustard earlier, in the soybeans. Buckwheat and mustard are two of the faster growing things. And so if it's a 45-day window because you're trying to get another crop in, those grow really fast. We've had organic guys that will just, yeah, they'll plant buckwheat for 45 days, excellent weed control. Then they'll till it into the ground and plant something else. Mustard can be used in very much the same way. Other things grow slower. And so we would probably lean towards the things that we know are going to grow very quickly, give you good weed control, give you good biomass early on, but it would still really depend on those initial questions that, we always need the answers to before we can make a recommendation.
Okay. And just to follow up on that one a little, is there any, I know it depends on the goals, but is there any species that you almost always include in your mixes, like regardless of the goal?
Yes, we have some of our favorites. Flax. Flax is actually one of them. We love flax. It's inexpensive. It's a relatively small seed, so you don't need very much in a mix. And it's Christine Jones describes flax as a plant. She says it punches above its weight. And what she means by that is it's a relatively small plant out there, but it brings big benefits to the soil with its root exudates, with its ability to kind of tie the systems of other plants together. It's not going to ever outcompete other plants, but it also doesn't get outcompeted. So a couple pounds of flax in a mix is just a great fit. We love sunflowers because they're inexpensive, they're deep tap roots, they grow pretty quickly. And again, just in moderation. I don't like to see more than a pound of sunflowers in most mixes.
Okay.
So those would be a couple, and then other things would be very dependent upon the season. But both of those aren't going to die with the first frost, and so you can widen that out a little bit more than something like a cowpea that first frost. Buckwheat would be another one. First frost, it's dead. So we love buckwheat in mixes, but you're a little bit more limited on where you can use it because it's so sensitive to frost.
hmm Great. That's good to have those in mind. And I'm going to pass it over to Shannon soon. I'll just ask one more question. Like, for you, is there any such thing as having too many cover crop species in a mix?
Well, if you ask my team who are mixing them, certainly the
They
answer
will
is
say,
yes.
yeah.
Because I see this big list, it's like, what? Uh, yes, there is because we have people that will submit mixes and they're putting things in there that aren't appropriate for their goals, that aren't appropriate for their time frame. And then at that point, it just becomes inefficient. It becomes a bit of a waste of money, if you will. So my answer is no, as long as it still meets your goals, it meets your geography, and it meets your time frame. And then
Okay.
at that point, I mean, you could argue, I mean, we sell 15 different kinds of sorghum. Well, you don't need to put all 15 types of sorghum in there. There's a law of diminishing returns when it comes to that. So maybe two of those is plenty. And so, it's not just about having 30 things in there, it's about having the right 12 things in there.
Oh,
And that means choosing from different plant families that bring different characteristics and not, having six kinds of sorghum.
amazing. Yeah, that's really good. Thank you, Keith. And I'll
Mhm.
send it over to Shannon to wrap us up.
Thank you for that. Gonna give Olivia 1 second. She's sharing the slides for me. Thank you all for tuning in today. This has been a wonderful discussion, and we appreciate Keith taking his time to join us. Be sure to check out Farmers for Soil Health, which you can learn more about at farmersforsoilhealth.com. A short Zoom survey will pop up once this webinar concludes. We would greatly appreciate it if you could provide us with your feedback. Also, to kick off the new year, we are hosting a two-part webinar series titled Strengthening Your Weed Control Program with Cover Crops with Dr. John Wallace on Monday, January 12th, followed by Dr. Anita Dilley on Tuesday, January 13th. We are also very excited to be teaming up with One Good Idea Shop Talks to offer 3 virtual farmer meetups. These will be on January 22nd, January 29th, and February 5th. Both of those registration links are in the chat now and will also be shared in this webinar's follow-up email. Access to the 1CCA Soil and Water CEU credit for the webinar is here. You can scan the QR code on the screen right now through the CCA app on your mobile device by selecting Scan Course Code or emailing Olivia the info on the screen. Olivia's email is in the chat. Keep a lookout for the follow-up email with the webinar recording, additional resources, and feedback survey. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. Our contact info is on the screen. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.